Ocarina of Time's price appears to have leaked via PlayAsia, with a headline conversion of the price suggesting the game could retail for as little as $60, lower than Donkey Kong Bonanza despite being a major Switch 2 launch title for 2026. Now, right up front, we should show extreme caution as Japan's games are generally less expensive as a rule. Star Fox was 6,480 yen, which translates to around $40 physically, whereas the title is $60 physical in the United States. Therefore, a $60 price tag in Japan would probably augur not a $60 game in the US, but rather something in the region of $80, which is more what people are expecting. And actually, I've been convinced for a while that the game will be $80. However, the key thing here is that this is being used as a driver for people to think that this game will be a lot more expansive than it necessarily will be. And I would very much caution people about using price as a metric to read into Nintendo's motives with the scale of the game one way or the other. Yes, scale is one factor that does affect the pricing of games, and since Doug Bowser's infamous comments on variable pricing, we have certainly seen evidence of smaller titles like Star Fox and Yoshi having lower prices, as indeed we did back along with Metroid Prime Remastered, a very full-effort revival of a classic title, which nevertheless retailed for a relatively very low price of $40. I can see how people would think, based on the treatment of Remastered and Star Fox, that there's a chance of a lower price but more limited in scope Ocarina, even if it's not what they're hoping for. However, I think that is a complete misreading. Star Fox, Metroid, even Yoshi, these are properties Nintendo really wants to push and make bigger. Star Fox and Metroid have been historically low sellers for the most part, while Yoshi has appealed to younger children, and this is a particularly important subset of their audience in an era where there aren't necessarily the same low-cost routes into their hardware. It's perfectly logical as a strategy to use price as a way to bolster the profile of these properties and get people to try these games which may well become part of the future nostalgia of people looking back on Nintendo. They don't need to do that with Zelda. Zelda is already basically pretty huge. They don't need to do it under normal circumstances, but they particularly don't in the 40th anniversary. They especially don't need to do it right before a major film. Sure, Super Mario Galaxy 1 plus 2 sold for $70 together, or $40 each, but while Nintendo actually rather underplayed the glow up on Mario, it's evident that Ocarina's graphical design is a world apart from what the Galaxies were offered. However, we can see that even Luigi's Mansion 2 HD and Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, two older games given extremely faithful HD versions on the Switch, were priced at the Switch's then top-tier pricing of $60. And that's likely because they knew these games could sell both now and in perpetuity at the higher price. People will be buying Ocarina for as long as it's on current hardware, and it's likely to be the landmark game of this generation. I don't really see a world where it isn't $80 physical, though probably $70 digital, irrespective, and this is the key point, irrespective of how extensive or not extensive the game's redevelopment is. I also think, frankly, even the original Ocarina of Time is likely to generate many, many, many play hours, and Nintendo know this. If the amount of playtime that can be gleaned from a game is part of their judgment of how they price games, and we pretty much know from the discussions around Mario Kart World that this is the case, then I don't see a way that they don't look at Ocarina of Time, albeit a small title, and think, yes, this is a game that will be played and replayed and played extensively and explored, and therefore will probably see people racking up dozens, scores, possibly hundreds of hours in it. Therefore, in their eyes, I think that categorizes it as an $80 title. I think in terms of how extensive a remake or rebranding the new version is, there probably is a space between something like Star Fox, broadly very faithful, and something like the Final Fantasy VII remake, in which Ocarina of Time would sit. But I would strongly expect the game to be far closer to the Star Fox model than to the Final Fantasy VII end of the spectrum, and particularly in those core elements of the game such as the dungeons, bosses, and the core beats of the narrative. Of course, if you're a true believer in a major revamp of the concept, that's not really a big issue, but really in this video I wanted to caution against the over-interpretation of price data. All that said, I do think there's one piece of evidence that might point to a more ambitious title in a really circuitous way. It's more in the rumour territory, which I'm normally cautious about diving into, but there's been talk of Twilight Princess possibly being revived for the anniversary window as well. Now, I've long been on the train that Twilight Princess will be the most logical next game for the Ocarina remake team, and ideally targeting a window of a potential Zelda sequel film in 2029. Ocarina plays with time, Twilight Princess plays with the kind of light world, dark world theme we've seen in various titles, and is the most modern iteration of that concept. Plus, it's notionally still the hero of time and set in Hyrule, so there is a strong chance that those assets could be cannibalized. This, of course, would sideline Majora's Mask, which is the more natural sequel, but while I love Majora, it is a weird little game that can be redeveloped later, but I don't think it has the same narrative utility and dominance in terms of Nintendo's film strategy as Twilight Princess. All that said, while this does make sense to me, I try to hold opinions lightly, and there are certainly other routes that Nintendo could go. They may take the view that they're going to be selling a ton of Zelda content in the next 12 months, and so having some sellable version of one of their most prominent games would make sense, since otherwise people might just end up cracking out older technology, which has a benefit to them in terms of raising the profile of their wares, but isn't something they can directly monetize. Routes for Twilight Princess could include Nintendo Switch Online releasing the GameCube version, but this would be an odd move, all things considered. Wind Waker, you can understand their thinking. Toon Link isn't really what they want to push right now, given the film's live action style, and so while I'm optimistic that one day they will return to the Toon Link games, I think that's probably quite a long way off. Twilight Princess might drive sales, but it would be a missed opportunity if they just relegated it to Nintendo Classics. Another option, therefore, is a limited release akin to Super Mario 3D All-Stars. I think in retrospect it's obvious that the reasons they wanted to do the limited releases in 2020 were that they had plans for 64 and Sunshine on Nintendo Switch Online, and possibly even at that time they knew they wanted Galaxy 1 Plus 2 for a future anniversary. It would be awkward for the game to be selling against itself after all. Limited editioning a modestly glowed up Twilight Princess re-release would be to me the strongest argument that Nintendo do have plans for Twilight Princess beyond the current version. However, if they go with the most obvious option and port Twilight Princess HD to Switch, possibly with an even swishier Nintendo Switch 2 edition delivered by the talented and reliable people at Tantalus, well, that's likely to be a far more faithful Twilight Princess, and so if Nintendo is going to revisit Twilight Princess at all, it would more or less have to be in the form of a far more substantial remake or redevelopment of the game. And if they're in the business of doing that, it therefore augurs well for Ocarina also being a more radical departure from the original. A game like this wouldn't be a 3-year project that they could target so confidently for a movie release date, but it could in fact be a far more substantial evolution of the original title. I think it's frankly unlikely all the same, as I don't see how Nintendo would want both the original and the remake on the same console, but I thought for a long time that Ocarina of Time being on Nintendo Classics limited the options for an imminent Ocarina, and yet circumstances change. The Switch 2 specifically made a new version feel far more likely to be ready, and we've also seen very recently that Super Mario Galaxy was able to get a release even though it's already had a Switch release of sorts. If Nintendo is thinking of a more spiritual reimagining of Twilight Princess for 6 or 7 years hence, or even 10 or 12 years in the future if they're prioritizing Majora's Mask first, well, I doubt they'll be too concerned about a bare bones release now affecting their plans in the distant future. A few quick forecasts, therefore, to round the video off, some of which amend or adjust things as said before, but of course all past forecasts will be reviewed when the time comes, so I'm never shy about offering different perspectives at different points, depending on the prevailing weather. Indeed, this is generally a practice of more accurate forecasts in the real world. Therefore, I would say 90% there's another Zelda title beside Ocarina announced before the end of 2027. I think that's incredibly likely. 30% though, Twilight Princess is playable in some way before the Zelda movie releases. It's still possible that Twilight Princess will crop up, and I don't dismiss the possibility, but it still, on balance, feels a little bit unlikely to me. At any rate, thanks as ever for watching. Do check out the Patreon for early ad-free and exclusive content, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.